Welcome to a brand new season of Going Underground. I'm Afshin Rattansi. Every Monday, Wednesday and Saturday, we're bringing you the stories that really matter in the United Kingdom as we provide an alternative angle to the mainstream line. In today's show, did the Charlie Hebdo killers of Paris train with Syrian rebels backed by Cameron and Obama? In a week of media speculation without the facts, we look at the state of journalism ahead of next week's trial of a CIA whistleblower with implications for press freedom on both sides of the Atlantic. And what's a mother to do? Buckingham Palace gears up for more newspaper revelations about the Queen's favourite son concerning unsubstantiated allegations involving alleged sex slaves. We talk to the Queen's former press secretary. Plus, after yesterday's A&E admissions figures, are political parties deliberately running down the NHS? All this and more on today's Going Underground. Veteran journalist Patrick Cockburn said after this week's atrocities in Paris that it was culpably naive to imagine that sparks from the Iraq-Syrian civil war wouldn't spread explosive violence to Western Europe. But how many UK journalists reflect on the fact that the killers of cartoonists in Paris may have been inspired or even trained by Western operatives working with rebels in Syria? David Cameron supports the rebels, and British and American intelligence agencies have been urgently reporting back to their bosses in London and Langley for years that taxpayer money is training Wahhabi jihadists. But where is that news in the mainstream media? Do we have a press freedom worth defending against those who would seek to curb it? Next week, a CIA whistleblower is due to go on a trial that will have repercussions for press freedom here in Britain. The US government believes that James Sterling is the source of stories about bizarre CIA plans to give nuclear technology to Iran, as revealed by New York Times journalist James Risen. You don't hear much about that in mainstream coverage or from David Cameron when he talks about Iran posing a nuclear threat to the world, though he did order heavies into a British newspaper to stop the Snowden revelations from becoming public. This is James Risen, who until recently faced jail for his journalism.
By launching criminal investigations of stories that are outside the mainstream coverage, they are trying to, in effect, build a pathway on which journalism can be conducted. Stay on the interstate highway of conventional wisdom with your journalism and you will have no problems. Try to get off and challenge basic assumptions and you will face punishment. Journalists have no choice but to fight back, because if they don't, they will become irrelevant.
One of journalism's greatest defenders has been Norman Solomon. The former congressional candidate has been part of the U.S. Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting Project. He founded the U.S. Institute for Public Accuracy and is part of the team behind ExposeFacts.org, a project to support whistleblowers and independent journalism. Welcome, Norman, to Going Underground. So can we be prouder here because we don't have a president trying to get people like James Risen on the New York Times and threatening them with jail?
Part of the role of government is to deceive. Unfortunately, the great muckraker journalist I.F. Stone in the United States decades ago said that all governments lie and nothing they say should be believed. And by that he meant you really need skepticism. So here we are, if we look at the United States, you've got the government attempting to force a New York Times journalist to betray his sources. James Risen, the reporter you mentioned. So this is a battle not only for freedom of the press, but really democracy.
They usually make journalists redundant, whether in Britain or America, and that's an easier way to censor someone than threaten them with jail.
Yes, indeed. Well, there are many ways to slice the onion and many ways to push journalists away from truth-telling. And one, and under certain regimes, simply put them in prison. Under what we call democratic regimes, there's redundancy declared, or what we call in the U.S. layoffs. People are fired. Sometimes it is totally ideological, and pressure coming from government officials encourages the bosses to push someone out of the newsroom.
I don't want to sound too patriotic, but even Seymour Hersh, the great exposer of the My Lai Vietnam massacre, he couldn't get pieces published about Syria chemical weapons in the New Yorker. I think it was. He had to publish in the London Review of Books.
Well, yes.
Is Britain getting better than the United States for journalism?
Well, frankly, it's a race to the bottom in many respects. But in the United States, we've had a major problem with the deterioration of media outlets that although there were never any great old days, at least had a bit more fortitude. New Yorker case in point. He, as you mentioned, Seymour Hersh ended up publishing in London magazine because his usual venue, the New Yorker magazine, declined to publish his against the conventional wisdom evidence that the White House was concocting its accusations about use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime.
I mean, this
in
is
Syria.
incredibly serious. Britain was on a pivot as to whether to go
Yes.
to war. The United States is kind of in war in Syria anyway. It was evidence like that Seymour Hersh was debunking that could have persuaded the British House of Commons to go that way or the other way.
Yes, and I understand that when the New Yorker declined to publish his expose, the Washington Post declined as well. This is symptomatic of the intersection between the warfare state and also the surveillance state, because if you have surveillance that is so far-reaching, then the confidentiality of sources is denied for journalists, and for would-be whistleblowers, there's no way to have any assurance that they can retain anonymity while they provide information to journalists that could go to the public, that the public has a right to know. So, you know, whether it's 10 Downing Street or the White House, we have people in charge who fundamentally do not believe in democracy. What they want is the uninformed consent to the governed. And when you step back and look at that, if the public is uninformed, how could it possibly be democracy? They simply are led by the nose in the dark.
But at least there's an irony here that British security agencies may be helping in the surveillance with American institutions, but at least British media is separate, although we're in front of Rupert Murdoch here, who owns things on both sides of the Atlantic.
Well, there's internalized nationalism and ideology. We have the basement of The Guardian being the site for smashing of hard drives under threat from the government, and we have a mechanism, one way or another, where governments pressurize media outlets, and sadly, The Guardian is a bit of an exception. Most of the daily papers in Great Britain are intimidated. We have the RIPA laws where the government is saying that it has a right to monitor the communications and the logs of records of communications between journalists and sources. Well, if you do that, then you're choking off the unofficial flow of information, and what's left? Official information, which is basically PR advertising, often lies. That's how Blair and Bush dragged us into war in Iraq. It's how Cameron and Obama are dragging us into further war in the Middle East. It's lies, and that is why it's so important for the liars at the top of the warfare state to insist that we not have authentic journalism. They want to choke off the access to sources who will tell us truthful information.
Now, there's also another aspect to this, which is that the media is changing because it's starting to be controlled by fewer internet companies. I know you've been writing a bit about the power of Amazon. Usually that's in the news here because of its tax avoidance scheme as a retailer. Tell me about your concerns about that company.
Well, many layers. You know, Amazon, now the largest online retailer in the world, has hundreds of millions of unique visitors every month to their sales sites. And one aspect of many is that about a year ago, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, the CIA, entered into a $600 million contract with Amazon. So you have Amazon Web Services basically housing on their servers, their cloud, as the saying goes, so much information from the CIA, and we're told other intelligence agencies. And Amazon announced, I'm quoting here, we look forward to a successful relationship with the CIA. What are the barriers or walls between Amazon customer information, whether it's Amazon UK or any other outlets of Amazon around the world, and CIA intelligence gathering? As we've seen from the NSA and the GCHQ, these are government agencies that are incorrigible in trying to vacuum up all the information they can get. Well, it's a treasure trove at Amazon. Amazon says, we safeguard all customer information, and yet you read the fine print, you know, the 1.5-point type that nobody reads when you say, I agree, and there are enough loopholes to fly a drone through in terms of what Amazon commits. Amazon essentially commits to nothing, and that's where the profit motive comes in, because apparently with 25 billion with a B dollars in personal wealth, it's not enough for Jeff Bezos. So in wanting and embarking upon this so-called successful relationship with the CIA, these are mutual services. And as I talked to one NSA whistleblower, he said, forget it. These are secret agreements. We have no idea what the actual contract is between Amazon and the CIA.
So when you ally all of this mass surveillance with hopefully a self-reflection within the media about mistakes made during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, where does it leave us as we approach wars in Iraq and Syria?
Well, I think it leaves us with an accentuated tension between integrity and conscience on the part of journalists and the go along to get along incentive to not incur the wrath of top officials. And I have to say, the British government has been obscenely contemptuous of the independence of the press. The efforts to intimidate and to assert the right, even to prior restraint, threatens along that regard, but also the attempt to just suppress the inclination or willingness of journalists to publish information, including classified data, that the government wants to keep under wraps. And that goes to the essence of the hostility toward democracy that we see at the top of these governments.
So for the first time, for years, and I know you've been complaining about this, is oligarch-owned media concentration of ownership. It's actually the government. It's not Rupert Murdoch, in a way. It's actually a state surveillance state, military-industrial complex, rather than the entrepreneurs.
I'd say it's the collusion and the intersection and the integration. Let's keep in mind that 70% of the NSA budget is going to private contractors. Edward Snowden was working for a private concern. It's a cash cow. We have not only in the U.S., but in Britain and elsewhere, essentially a military-industrial intelligence complex where enormous rake-offs or profits are taking place. And so it's, at this point, very difficult to separate government and corporations. We in the West, certainly on both sides of the Atlantic, U.S. and U.K., were brought up to believe that censorship and the ominous destruction of the right to communicate comes from inordinate state power, but it also can come from corporate power and the collusion of the two.
Norman Solomon, thank you.
Thank you.
We contacted Amazon about the allegations made in that interview. They said,
"Our customers can only access their own data and cannot access data belonging to any other customer. At Amazon, we are extremely vigilant about protecting our customers' data and have implemented sophisticated technical and physical measures to prevent unauthorized access. The suggestion that one customer might have access to other customers' data is completely false and uninformed." An Amazon Web Services spokesperson.
Coming up in part 2 of Going Underground, dictators, B-movie stars and convicted paedophiles. We look at the friends of the prince known as Randy Andy with the Queen's former press secretary. And David Cameron admits he's powerless. All this and more after the break. This week, a former Tory Defence Minister, Lord Dykes, claimed that the delay in the publication of the Chilcot inquiry into the war in Iraq was something to do with Tony Blair facing war crimes charges. Hours later, the leader of the House of Commons had this question for the Prime Minister at the first PMQs of 2015.
Reverting to the subject of the Chilcot report, about which I have questioned the Prime Minister in the past, did he note that our distinguished colleague Lord Hurd in the House of Lords yesterday said it was an absolute disgrace that it has not been published, a view which I certainly hold. And since it is absolutely well known by the cognoscenti that the report was completed many months ago, who is it, if the Prime Minister is helpless on this subject, who is blocking it? Is it the Secretary of the Cabinet? Is it Sir John Chilcot? Or is it the White House?
Barack Obama preventing the release of an independent inquiry by Privy Councillors into Britain's invasion of Iraq? Surely not.
To the Father of the House, I'd say, my understanding is this. The report is largely finished, but in every report like this, there is a process where you have to write to those people who are criticised in the report, and you have to give them an opportunity to respond.
But surely Tony Blair is busy sorting out peace in the Middle East. How does he even have time to respond to allegations that he is a war criminal or whatever else the bizarre panel members of the Chilcot inquiry came up with?
This is now the process for all of these reports, whatever government they are launched under. It's known as the salmonization process.
What process? Well, maybe Tony Blair is a salmon and salmon return home to die, though Cameron asked himself whether it was actually to do with Scotland rather than Scottish salmon.
Although quite why, I'm not sure. I don't think it's got anything to do with the former First Minister in Scotland. But nonetheless, this is not within my power to grant the publication of this report.
If the Prime Minister doesn't have the power, that still doesn't explain an absurd rationale to Chilcot's excuses, though, according to Welsh nationalist Elfyn Llwyd.
Those of us who opposed the Iraq War for very good reason, and many other people outside this place, are very concerned about the inordinate delay in publishing the findings of the Chilcot report. Can I ask the Prime Minister, please, where did this bizarre notion come from that if it's not published before the end of February, we can't see it until after the election? What about the month of March?
The PM seemed to agree.
Well, in many ways, I share the Right Honourable Gentleman's frustration in that, I would love this report to have come out already. And indeed, he and I voted together against the last Labour government over and over again, saying, please, can you get on and set up the independent inquiry that's needed? And if they'd got on and set up the independent inquiry, it would have been published, debated and dealt with by now.
No wonder Ed Miliband never asks about the Chilcot inquiry. Labour may forever take an electoral hit for launching a war with millions of dead and wounded and refugees. He instead wanted to talk about the disastrous health of the NHS.
When he decided to ignore the pleas of doctors, nurses and patients and plough ahead with his damaging top-down reorganisation, wasn't it blindingly obvious that if you divert $3 billion out of patient care, it would have a big impact on A&E?
But Cameron wanted to talk about war, not A&E.
You can see this as plain as you like. The leader of the opposition apparently said to the political editor of the BBC, I want to weaponise the NHS. That's what he said. Now, I think that is disgraceful. The NHS is not a weapon. It's a way we care for our families. It's a way we care for the elderly. It's a way we look after the frail. So perhaps when he gets to his feet, he will deny that he said he wanted to weaponise the NHS, a disgusting thing to say.
Presumably not as disgusting as the depths both parties will be going to as the general election campaign kicks off. Sunday looks set to see more unsubstantiated allegations in the British media about Prince Andrew and his sexual involvement with an underage girl procured by his billionaire pal Jeffrey Epstein. After initial reticence, Buckingham Palace eventually denied the allegations. But what should the palace do with a prince who remained friends with a convicted paedophile after his release from prison? Her Majesty's former press secretary and author of On Duty with the Queen, Dickie Arbiter, is back with us again. Welcome back,
Thank you,
Dickie, to the show. So why has the palace felt the need to even comment about the allegations?
Well, the allegations were very serious, and you have to say something. It's no good burying your head in the sand and saying nothing. That was the sort of thing that happened in the past. These are serious allegations about the Duke of York allegedly having sex with an underage teenager, which is absolute nonsense. I mean, he's does some silly things, but he wouldn't be that silly. And I think these allegations came about as a result of his association with Jeffrey Epstein and nothing more.
So you would have advised the same as the current spin doctors of the palace?
Well, we don't like to call them spin doctors, but yeah, I would have advised the same. I would probably come out a bit sooner rather than be prompted and hassled by the newspapers. That as soon as you get wind of something, then you let everybody know that there is no truth in these allegations.
But it did seem odd. I mean, our head of state, and initially no comment. Then you sort of get it dragged out. I mean, So you can't remember. This is basically unprecedented.
It is unprecedented, and I think the problem is that they might well have been prepared, but they certainly wouldn't say something until they've taken legal advice, which they obviously did, and the legal advisors had spoken to the Duke of York to get substantial guarantees that he was not involved, and it was only on that basis that they would tick the box and tell the Paris to go ahead. So there's a bit of time in order to get these things into motion. But they did it, and good on them.
Because the response seemed very legal, didn't it, when it came to whether the Queen had met the alleged sex slave Virginia Roberts? Because they didn't say, no, the Queen hadn't met her. They went, there's no record of her meeting her.
Well, that's the way they did it. I mean, this was something that was put out by the father, by Sky Roberts, and 2 days later he backtracked, got it wrong. And when you get little things wrong, you wonder whether the big things are wrong as well. There's certainly been no complaint to Scotland Yard, which puts a big question mark over whether this actually happened in the first place.
Yeah, but you were a journalist before you were press secretary to the Queen, and a journalist knows that if they say there's no record of it, that usually means that's not a denial.
Well, when it's people meeting the Queen at Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle or wherever, there is always a record, because everybody who meets the Queen is put down in a book as having met her. So they will know whether somebody has met or not. Certainly not out of the
Well, you
book.
worked with Princess Diana, and we know from her diaries that people came through the back door of the palace.
Yeah, but
Clarence
not,
House,
you know,
so
I'm not talking about the Queen on a walkabout. I'm talking about in the building, whether it's Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Sandringham, Balmoral, or wherever she is. There will be a record as to whether she has met an individual. There is no record, and that's the way they put it. There's no record.
You see, some celebrities, corporations might be looking at this and thinking, we'd have slapped a super injunction on it so that the British people wouldn't even know that we'd have gagged the press from covering the story. Why do you think that doesn't happen? And did it happen in your time?
No,
when there were
it's
stories like
very
that?
difficult to slap a super injunction, because while the injunction might work in the UK, it doesn't work elsewhere.
There wasn't really any chance that Prince Andrew was going to be extradited anyway, according to the plea bargain, as far as we understand, as regarding his billionaire friend. So why the need to deny it? I mean, they could have kept quiet, because there's no reason that he would ever have been extradited to the
Well,
US.
you know, you say there was no record of plea bargaining. As far as all the reports that are coming out, he was not included in any list in plea bargaining. And what Ms. Roberts is doing is getting hold of the justice system to find out why she wasn't consulted and what the terms of the deal were. It's just the fact that Andrew has got caught in the crossfire of it all. No good ignoring it. If these allegations come out, you've got to say something.
What is it about Prince Andrew and his friends with... Certainly he's been associated with pretty dodgy regimes. You were last on this show talking about how the royals are used by governments as trade envoys with some regimes. I think you mentioned Indonesia under Suharto. Mm-hmm. Is Prince Andrew a victim here, used by governments to talk with people like Ilayev of Azerbaijan? Because there he is with him. I don't know whether the government told him to hang out with this billionaire convict.
Well, the government wouldn't have told him to hang out, but the thing is that he did have a job as heading up British Trade International as an ambassador. His job was to go out to various countries in the world where the government sent him, not his choice, and to drum up business.
And then they sacked him.
Well, they sacked him for a very good reason, because he was seen with Jeffrey Epstein in 2011 in Central Park and photographed after the man had come out of jail having served 13 months of an 18-month sentence. Not very good. It's not good PR to be seen photographed with somebody who's a registered sex offender.
Do you think the Queen would have advised Andrew not to hang out with this billionaire convict?
Well, you know, you can tell somebody that not a good idea to do it, but you're only as good as the advice that's been taken. And how do you tell a 40-something you shouldn't do that? I mean, 40-something will turn around to the mum and dad and say, well, you know, my decision.
Sure, but I suppose the dangers with Prince Andrew is that he's on the record as arguing that inquiries into Saudi Arabian arms deals were wrong. He was criticizing the Guardian newspaper about even releases from WikiLeaks. And, I mean, how far can he go into this obviously political, financial world, hang out with these sorts of people without anyone being able to just stop him, as it were?
Well, it's a very difficult one, because if you're acting on behalf of the British government, they tell you where to go, and you've got to go. You can't say, no, I'm not doing it.
Yeah, but then not have drinks with them later on. In your book, you mentioned that Princess Diana and Prince Charles, I mean, they did the job, but then they went out of their way to do humanitarian things that weren't on the normal schedule. This seems to be a case of people getting too involved in the financial element.
I think the biggest problem with Andrew, he was too easily wooed and got carried along in the draft of flattery. These guys, they flatter. They know how to flatter, and if you've got a member of the British royal family, they're going to flatter in order to, be part of that inner circle. In fact, they're not part of the inner circle. It's neither here nor there. But they think because they've got a member of the royal family there that their quid's in.
And what would you advise him now?
Well, I'd advise him to sort of pick and choose your friends. There's an old saying, tell me who your friends are and I'll tell you who you are. And quite frankly, he hasn't been very good at picking his friends. He now needs to step back, take stock of his life, and start all over again.
Of course, there is actually just this one last question, the chance that it has been offered in the press, again speculation, that there may be blackmail tapes and so on, which is why poor Prince Andrew, in effect, had to kind of remain friends with this man.
Well, we don't know. I mean, it's all maybe, it's all ifs and buts, it's all speculation. At the moment, we've got to look at it for what it is, and what it is at the moment is a lady by the name of Virginia Roberts making allegations, pointing the finger at the Duke of York that he had underage sex with her. Buckingham Palace have come out very strongly. They wouldn't have come out so strongly without cast iron guarantees, A, from the Duke of York, and the tick in the box from the legals.
Tiki Arbiter, as always, thanks again.
Thank you.
It's the depths of winter, and the NHS has so far come down with a nasty bout of austerity cuts, followed by a crippling case of declining nurses. As for NHS Direct, it's already been amputated before the weather set in. The prognosis? An NHS that has the longest A&E waiting times in a decade, ambulances that take hours to arrive, and thousands of patients with no access to beds left on trolleys.
I would say when the health service can't function and it has to make a declaration of that kind, that is a crisis.
But what about the people who are being seen? In the last decade, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency received almost 100,000 reports of faulty medical equipment linked to over 2,300 deaths and 22,000 injuries. Reports of faulty equipment from this year range from failing batteries on life-saving heart machinery to wheelchairs that could suddenly tip backwards, with the most failures reported in high-tech equipment used in operations and intensive care. But according to the MHRA, the figures could be widely underreported and up to 5 times higher. But this is just one symptom of what ails the NHS. British taxpayers may spend half as much on healthcare as Americans do, and may trail Ireland, Germany and France in health spending, but it's still arguably been the most efficient health system in the world. Those arguing for the defining principles of the NHS believe that politicians lobbied by private healthcare providers are the reason there are too few GPs. The more criticism of the NHS, the more calls for reform. No wonder the Tories' cure is a healthy dose of austerity washed down with a sugary spoonful of privatisation and a tincture of TTIP, which could mandate the wholesale break-up of the NHS. That's it for today, but join us again on Monday. In the meantime, you can connect to us via Twitter, Facebook, SoundCloud and email. And don't forget RT UK News with Bill Dodd every weekday evening on the hour from 6 till 10. See you on Monday.